I'd like to welcome everyone for coming this evening to our panel discussion called The Intersection of Mental Disorders, Incarceration, and Restorative Justice, a subject that has not received much attention so far, so it should be an interesting evening. I'm Kathy Gorley, and I am representing Friends of Restorative Justice of Washtenaw County. This discussion is part of a series of educational events being put on by us and the Dispute Resolution Center in Washtenaw County. The purpose of this series is to educate people about restorative justice. I'd like to start by telling you a little bit of the history of our group, Friends of Restorative Justice, which we abbreviate FORGE often. So if you hear FORGE, that means Friends of Restorative Justice. FORGE started out with a different name. We started out being called Healing Communities. And it was a collaboration of people from different faith communities around Washtenaw County, Michigan, all working to repair the harm caused by crime and the harm caused by our criminal justice system. Shalom Community Church, the local Mennonite congregation, joined Healing Communities and taught the rest of us about restorative justice. Restorative justice has been practiced by the Mennonites for 50 years. Although restorative justice itself has been in use much longer by indigenous communities in North America and other continents around the world. Shalom members showed us a play called Tough Case that demonstrates the use of restorative justice after a group of teenagers vandalize and steal things from an older woman's home. After restorative justice conference, the two parties understood each other better. The woman was no longer afraid to live in her house. The boy returned items that had been stolen, and he repaired the damage he'd done. After viewing this, we realized that restorative justice offers a better way of responding to crime and healing from it than the way our government usually responds. Healing Communities decided to turn its attention entirely on restorative justice for the next year. That was 2014, and we're still doing it. We're still working on restorative justice. We learned restorative justice was already being used, although in a limited capacity, by Washtenaw County Circuit Court Judge Tim Connors in child custody cases. Judge Connors was sending cases to our local Dispute Resolution Center, a nonprofit that trains facilitators to do mediation and restorative circles. We renamed ourselves Friends of Restorative Justice at this time. In 2022, Washtenaw County is in a much better place with respect to restorative justice compared to 2014. It is being used by our county prosecutor, several of our judges, and the Ann Arbor City Prosecutor's Office. Many people have been trained to facilitate restorative justice conferences or circles. Until now, most restorative justice has taken place in county buildings or more recently on Zoom. At this point, the Dispute Resolution Center and FORGE feel there needs to be an independent space conducive to community restoration where the conferences and circles can be done. FORGE and the Dispute Resolution Center are asking county commissioners to help find a dedicated space in the community for a restorative justice center. Okay, as for this evening's meeting, now that we're up to the present, a few technical issues. This meeting is being recorded. Afterward, a link to the recording will be put on FORGE's website. I assume you're all registered for this, and because of that, we have your email addresses, so we'll send the link to you also. Questions will be taken as time permits at the end of this evening. You can also put your questions into the chat as they occur to you. If you have not already muted yourself, please do so now. And I will turn over the microphone to Belinda Doolin now, the director of the Dispute Resolution Center, who will introduce our panelists this evening.
Thank you, Kathy. I'm Belinda Doolin with the Dispute Resolution Center, and I thank all of you for being here tonight, and a special thank you for those who agreed to be on the panel for discussion. The DRC is known, the Dispute Resolution Center, known as the DRC, is a nonprofit organization that offers affordable, constructive, restorative, and healing approaches to conflict resolution to all people in Washtenaw and Livingston counties. Very quickly, before I make the introductions of our panelists, it's important that I acknowledge that as a nonprofit, we do not endorse any candidate for office. This forum was developed before the recent candidacy announcements for the sheriff's office were made. So just want to footnote that. Now for the introductions of our panel members. Professor Tom Hoffmeister reads as, after completing the joint degree of Juris Doctorate, PhD in Law and Psychology program at the University of Nebraska, Professor Hoffmeister served as an assistant counsel in the litigation division of counsel's office of the Office of Mental Health for the state of New York for almost 5 years. He then joined the National Center for State Courts and his Institute on Mental Disability and the Law as a senior staff attorney and research assistant for roughly 6 years, while also teaching courses which included mental health law at Marshall Wythe School of Law at the College of William and Mary. In addition, for 9 years, he was the Director of Legal Studies at the Institute of Law, Psychiatry, and Public Policy at the University of Virginia, and for 12 years, he was the Associate Professor at the University of Virginia School of Law, where among many courses, he taught at least once a year a class that was titled Psychiatry and Criminal Law, and another class titled Mental Health Law. He has made well over 100 presentations to various professional organizations and groups and has well over 100 publications to his name, including an article that provides the foundation for today's presentation entitled Forging Links and Renewing Ties, Applying the Principles of Restorative and Procedural Justice to Better Respond to Criminal Offenders with a Mental Health Disorder. Welcome, Professor Hoffmeister. We also have Director Derek Jackson of our Washtenaw County Sheriff's Office. Mr. Jackson came on with the Sheriff's Office in 2009, and many have come to know him as the social worker that became a police officer. Director Jackson graduated from Eastern Michigan University with a bachelor's in social work in 1998. While receiving his master's in social work from the University of Michigan, Derek worked at the Maxey Training School, where he had his introduction into the criminal justice system. In 2000, he began his work at Ozone House, spending the next several years in the trenches, working the streets of Washtenaw County's at-risk young people. In 2004, Mr. Jackson set his eyes on elected office, where he ran for the Ypsilanti Township Board of Trustees. And although he would lose by 1 vote, that experience would not go unnoticed. County Clerk Larry Kestenbaum appointed Mr. Jackson as the Director of Elections for the County of Washtenaw, where he remained until coming to the Sheriff's Office in 2009. With a background in direct service, community organizing, and politics, he continues his commitment to the community by serving on numerous local boards, committees, and by volunteering with several youth organizations. Our third panel guest will be our State Representative Felicia Braybeck. Representative Braybeck will be joining us momentarily. Representative Braybeck is serving her first term representing the 55th House District, which encompasses portions of Washtenaw County, including Ann Arbor City, Ann Arbor Township, Milan City, Pittsfield Township, Augusta, and York Townships. Dr. Braybeck is a practicing clinical psychologist with a master's degree in clinical social work with over 2 decades of experience. As a practicing psychologist, she sees up close how decisions made by our state government affects people's everyday lives and has pledged to bring the full breadth of her experience with clients to the bargaining table every day. Having served on the Washtenaw County Board of Commissioners for over 9 years, Representative Braybeck understands the importance of working with others to create a community we all want to live in. During her time on the commission, she led the effort to create the county's first racial equity policy and has worked on everything from protecting our environment to supporting our schools. Representative Braybeck plans to get things done by bridging the gap between elected officials and residents and helping to make sure elected officials are held accountable to the people they serve. She looks forward to tackling environmental justice issues, educational inequity, criminal justice reform, and improving mental health care in our state. Thank you again to our panel guests for being here tonight. And now Joe Summers will give us some remarks.
Good evening. As one of the organizers of our program tonight, I've been asked to say a few words about why this topic is so important to me. I guess for me, part of it dates back to when I became the administrator of the Shelter for the Homeless in Ann Arbor in 1984, and found myself continually shocked by what a large percentage of our clients suffered from chronic mental illnesses. I came to understand this was because of the failure of our state agencies when they closed down our state mental hospitals and then provided few resources to help people in their transition back into the community. My thought at the time was that this was so inhumane that surely this problem would be addressed expeditiously. I was thus further shocked when 3 or 4 years later I began to work with people in our state prisons and found what appeared to be about the same percentage of folks in our state prisons suffering from chronic mental illnesses. The way they were treated and the horrific conditions many of them were living in, particularly in solitary confinement, simply defy description. If we judged our state mental hospitals to be inhumane places to house people with chronic mental illnesses, how on earth can we imagine housing them in state prisons as more humane? Over the last 5 or 10 years, our county sheriff has frequently spoken of how our county jail is the largest mental health facility in our county because of what a large percentage of our jail population suffers from chronic mental illnesses. If you can judge how civilized a society is by its correction system, we're clearly living in a pretty barbaric society. So whether we're talking about the state level or the county level, we're paying enormous sums of money to lock up people whose crimes are so often connected to their mental health issues. I would suggest incarceration is currently one of the major ways our society is responding to mental illness. I'd also suggest we could also help these people live far healthier and happier lives if we could take a restorative justice approach to their crimes by creatively working with them to understand how their behaviors have impacted others and help them figure out what they need to do to stay out of trouble. And we could do this paying significantly less than we're currently paying to incarcerate them. We need to begin somewhere, and I would suggest our county is as good a place as any. Thank you. Back to you, Belinda.
Thank you, Joe. We're going to get started hearing from our guest panelists, and we're going to begin with Professor Hoffmeister. In the next 20 minutes, can you share the insight of your work in this intersection that we're talking about today? Professor.
There we go. How's that? Well, I will certainly give it a try. First things first, let me see if I can pull up my slideshow. And I have to follow all the directions. And up here, there should be something that says slideshow. I'm beginning. Aha! Did it work? I'll take that as a yes. So thank you very much. Oh, good. Looks like it's working. For the introduction. And Joe, thank you for your comments. You've almost made what I have to say beside the point. You've covered the issues wonderfully well. I'm here tonight to discuss an alternative to our traditional criminal justice system response to offenders with a mental disorder, namely the use of the restorative justice model. But before I do that, let me say a few words about the impact of mental disorders on individuals in general. As many of you know, mental illnesses affect a person's thinking, mood, and/or their behavior. They also range from having a relatively mild impact on a person to having an extremely severe impact. Indeed, the World Health Organization has identified 5 of the top 10 chronic disabling disorders in the world as being mental illness related. Serious mental illnesses include bipolar disorders, depressive disorders, and schizophrenia. And they interfere with a person's life and ability to function. At the same time, over a third of all individuals with a serious, severe mental illness receive no treatment, and almost half of them because they simply couldn't afford it. It's also important to emphasize that a mental illness is not a choice, it's not a weakness, it's not a character flaw. It's not something that just passes in and out. It's not something a person can just simply snap themselves out of. Furthermore, it tends to be a lifelong impairment, although there are treatments available. The specific causes of mental illness are largely unknown, although we are beginning to identify factors that increase the risk of a mental illness, including one's family history, one's brain chemistry, and whether the person has experienced significant life events that were traumatic in their nature. With this in mind, I have identified and published a few years ago 10 principles that I argue should guide society's response to offenders with a mental disorder. First, we need to keep in mind that many individuals have a mental illness. In fact, nearly 1 in 5 American adults today live with a mental illness. Furthermore, many of those individuals also experience a serious mental illness, with estimates being that over 13 million US adults currently have a serious mental illness. Second of all, we need to recognize that mental disorders encompass a widely diverse set of disorders and assume many forms. As a result, they affect individuals in many different ways. Third, mental disorder is not an all or nothing phenomenon. They tend to fluctuate significantly over time. They will interfere with some functions and not others. Fourth, an untreated mental disorder can be a terrible experience for the person suffering from one. Okay? At the same time, the disorder tends to be badly misunderstood by those around the person. Okay? Generally, the presence of a mental disorder upsets these other individuals, frightens them, and there's a likelihood that the risk of dangerousness from the individual is greatly overestimated. But the research indicates that the person with a mental disorder is far more likely to be the victim of a crime, of a violent crime, than to be the perpetrator. In part, as a result of this overestimation of the dangerousness posed by such individuals, these individuals are more likely to come into contact with the criminal justice system, with estimates that 25 to 40% of individuals with mental illness will come into contact with the criminal justice system at some point in their life. In turn, as a result of this, a large percentage of individuals brought to the attention of the criminal justice system have a mental disorder. Nevertheless, such individuals remain human beings, entitled to the respect and dignity given all human beings. Furthermore, and this is a key to our application of the restorative justice model to them, human interactions generally remain important to them. Furthermore, how they are treated by others tends to have a significant impact on them. In addition, they are generally able to learn from the consequences of their behavior, to benefit from being held accountable, to be deterred from further criminal behavior, and to change their behavior going forward. In addition, they often feel remorse for their criminal behavior, feel empathy for the victims of that behavior, and are able to communicate about the behavior itself. They may even feel that their actions were justified, or at least are understandable. And they may believe that they have been treated unfairly by the criminal justice system and society in general. As a result of all of this, responding appropriately to a criminal offender with a mental disorder is a complex undertaking. there are many complicating factors that must be taken into account, including the fact that many of them struggle with a co-occurring substance abuse disorder. Many of them lack employment or housing or emotional support in the community. They may have a history of experiencing discrimination. They may have been widely misunderstood in the past. They may feel like they've been mistreated in general. Any response we craft for this population needs to take all these factors into account. Finally, it must be recognized that our traditional response to this population, namely placing them in a correctional facility, tends to place these individuals at great risk, as these facilities generally do not provide the appropriate milieu for treating a mental disorder. Now, in recognition of this final principle, during the past half century or so, various alternative models for addressing these individuals' needs have emerged. In general, they focus on diverting them away from the criminal justice system, enhancing the likelihood of their success should they return to the community again, and finally, minimizing the likelihood that they will reoffend. But it has also been recognized that the appropriate model to employ depends on the needs of the individual and the resources made available in the community. Now, before discussing these alternative models, I need to say a bit more about our traditional response, namely the use of the criminal justice system. The criminal justice system is intended to work on a society-wide basis and to address societal harm. It does not focus on redressing the harm experienced by individuals. To do this, it employs publicly funded attorneys who represent the community at large. The victims of crimes generally are kept at arm's length from these proceedings, ostensibly to prevent their emotions from distorting the proceedings themselves and the outcomes. But the result of this is that little attention is given to the impact of the crime on the victim, as well as any future interactions between the victim and the offender, a scenario that often arises. In addition, the criminal justice system focuses on punishment, not rehabilitation, with incarceration the typical outcome, which in turn, as you've heard, has resulted in a large percentage of our population being incarcerated in an overcrowded prison jail system, with few resources provided to attend to the individual needs of inmates. This, in turn, has resulted in a very high rate of recidivism among offenders in general. Furthermore, the victims of these crimes tend to be highly dissatisfied with the outcomes of this approach. Their input is very limited, and they are often largely left out of the loop. In addition, little attention is given to redressing the harm that they've experienced. So, turning toward jails and prisons, and again, focusing on offenders with mental disorder. As noted earlier, many individuals with mental disorder will become entangled in the criminal justice system. Indeed, it is now widely agreed that our jails, our prisons, have become our de facto mental health system. This is a system which provides very little, if any, needed mental health treatment to these individuals. This has resulted in a system where jailed persons with a mental illness tend to continually cycle through the system. But we are reaching a growing consensus that incarceration is not an appropriate placement for much of this population, and various alternatives for managing this population are beginning to be formulated, which I will now turn to. The first is probation. This is an option that has long been a component of the criminal justice system. Under this option, an offender is placed on probation rather than placed in jail or prison, and various conditions of probation are imposed that the individual must meet to remain free. For offenders with a mental disorder, these conditions typically require obtaining mental health treatment. But because offenders have little input into the nature of this regime, typically they don't embrace it, and often it is not very effective. Also, often the required treatment just simply isn't available, or they don't have the ability to access it. Recognizing this, a second option are drug courts. Drug courts began to emerge in this country around 1989, and we now have over 2,500 of them across the country. You can find a drug court in virtually every state. Typically, low-level drug offenders are diverted via this mechanism into a substance abuse treatment program. Now, this would seem to have some potential for offenders with mental disorder, as many of them also have a co-occurring substance abuse problem. But this mechanism tends not to address these offenders' mental health needs, usually just imposes a drug testing and treatment program. Plus, again, it's a relatively coercive approach with little input obtained from the offender, which tends not to be an effective way of addressing mental health disorders. Recognizing these limitations, beginning at the end of the 20th century, and with over 300 in place now, are mental health courts. Like drug courts, these typically focus on low-level, non-violent offenses, with the offenders diverted into a mental health treatment regime. Usually, the presiding judge, the offender, the defendant's attorney, and the prosecuting attorney get together and agree on a mandated supervised community mental health treatment program that the offender is expected to comply with. But again, it's often difficult to obtain the needed services. The offender tends to see them as imposed on him or her, and so they tend not to buy into it. And then again, as with all these options, participation by input from the victim tends to be quite limited, if present at all. As a result of the limitations associated with these alternatives, in recent years, we have seen the emergence of the restorative justice model as applied to this population. This model moves beyond the criminal justice system's emphasis on imposing punishment and seeks to promote reparation for the harm caused, the reintegration of the offender back into the community, and the restoration of a moral equilibrium within the community. It's been found to succeed when both the victim and the offender voluntarily participate in a session designed to reach a just and equitable outcome. This approach relies on informal interactions, much like mediation, among the victim, the offender, and relevant members of the community. And this may include family members of the offender. The goal is to develop a mutual understanding among the participants, to repair the harm done, and to take steps to prevent future harm. Typically, these sessions involve an exchange of information so all can appreciate what precipitated the crime and its impact. And the hope is that a core sequence will occur where the offender expresses shame and remorse for his or her actions, which in turn is followed by forgiveness from the victim. The restorative justice approach believes the focus should be on healing the wounds caused by a criminal act, not punishing the offender. To do this, the primary participants should be the victim, the offender, and relevant community members, not the state. This will restore a sense of control to the victims and help them heal, as well as provide positive effects for the offenders. They are able to see that they aren't being written off as non-persons and that efforts are being made to rehabilitate and return them to the community. Further, this process can be cathartic for them. They are allowed to explain their actions, but also to see what impact their actions had on others. In turn, the goal is that they will be able to move beyond their own grudges with society, accept responsibility for their actions, and renew their bonds with the community. Now, I also have to note that there are generally 3 prerequisites for this approach to work. First, generally, an examination is made of the nature of the crime and the charges involved. Most restorative justice programs only accept offenders who have committed lesser crimes. This may be limited to even misdemeanors, although there is some pushback on this in recent years. But in general, the more serious, the more violent crimes are seen as better addressed by the traditional criminal justice system. Second prerequisite, both the offender and the victim must be prepared and able to participate and embrace the results of these meetings. This means they must be willing and able to communicate with and understand one another. And this means they need a functional ability to participate. And an active mental health problem can curtail this ability. So usually what we do is we look to see, can they communicate and understand what the other participants are saying? Do they have the requisite ability to empathize with the victim? And are they willing to discuss their mental illness and its impact frankly? So it's worth noting that a certain level of mental health treatment may be needed before the offender can even participate in such a session. But again, this is part of the screening process. Third, you need somebody to facilitate these programs and know what they're doing. They need to be specially trained to understand and work with mental disorders. Okay, more specifically, to work with offenders with mental disorder. They must be able to design a program with the offender's mental health needs in mind. They must be able to recognize how a mental disorder can impact communications. And they must be able to help the victims and the community participants understand the impact of mental disorders in general. It's worth noting, however, that there are potential criticisms of this approach. Okay, one is that the outcomes of these sessions will not be consistent across cases. Each case tends to be resolved on a one-by-one basis. Okay. Also, concerns that what is imposed on the offender is not proportional to the crime, or that this approach will be too soft on crime, thereby failing to deter this offender from future offenses and other offenders from committing crimes themselves. There's also fear that the victims in these proceedings may be subject to pressures and manipulations to put them in a bad place. Another fear is that the legal rights of the offenders will be infringed by this process. This will just turn into a form of vigilantism or popular justice. Nevertheless, the empirical evidence is quite encouraging. Okay. Generally, victims walk away from these sessions feeling a decreased sense of fear, anger, and anxiety. They generally feel better about themselves, and they're generally better able to forgive the offender for what happened and to attain a sense of closure so that they can move forward with their lives. Similarly, positive outcomes are associated with the offenders involved. The rates of restitution and compliance with the outcome are generally quite high. The offenders see the programs generally as relatively fair and just, which leads them in turn to act in a more positive manner moving forward. There's also a noticeable reduction in the recidivist rates of the offenders involved. And generally, the offenders are better able to reconnect with society. To sum up, restorative justice has deep historical roots, which many of you are very aware of, and is particularly well suited for addressing offenders with a mental disorder. By promoting a sense of community and healing, this approach can both address the victim's needs as well as address the offender's needs for mental health treatment and support. In addition, this approach can help the community gain a better understanding of the impact of mental disorders in general and the need for community mental health services. The bottom line, forgiveness and restoration should not be out of reach for offenders with a mental disorder or who are suited for this undertaking. Thank you. Get out.
Thank you so much. Very inspiring and informative. I appreciate seeing all the data. We're going to transition to Director Derek Jackson. Go ahead and get started, and I believe you may have can you share your screen? You're able to do that. I think you had a PowerPoint as well. Okay, thank you.
Yep, and I'm just going to share just a couple of quick slides. Again, thank you very much. I think this is a very important conversation, so happy to be here and participate. I know a lot of people, as we were starting up, were asking about LEAD and interested in talking about LEAD, which we're going to talk about. But I wanted to start with something a little bit broader than just LEAD. So when we have this conversation around that intersection of restorative practices with mental health or mental illness and incarceration, we take a step back further. So there's something called the sequential intercept map that I think is really important because this has been our roadmap for how we've designed some of the things we do here at the Washtenaw County Sheriff's Office and really for community mental health at the county level. And it's just these 6 doorways into the system, from the community, law enforcement, kind of initial detention, the jails and courts, reentry, and community corrections. And the reason I show that again is because it's the roadmap, and when you really break down and look at what we do at each one of those doors that someone might enter into the criminal justice system, you can then start to see where your gaps in your services are. So when we first started this, there were a couple of things we did within the sheriff's office to kind of fit each one of those intercepts. Very few things, but there were some, right? And then as we expanded, kind of right before the millage was passed, we had started to do a lot of work in this space because we realized there were so many gaps along that continuum. And then once the millage passed, it really allowed us to do some of these things that are in bold. And I'm just going to highlight a few of them before I get into more specifics of LEAD. So again, we're talking about mental health and the intersection with restorative practices and incarceration, but there are some things that happen on the community side that are really, really important, right? So like Sure Moms is a group that people have heard about, but it really is about moms and support for them and kind of a support group for moms who have kids involved in the criminal justice system. And you may say, well, why is that important? Well, and why is it that a law enforcement agency like the sheriff's office does that work? And I can talk all day just about the Sure Moms program, but I think some of these community level things before someone gets involved in the system are really, really important. Like, how do we get upstream related to this conversation? I'm going to talk a little bit more about We Live here in a minute, so I'll skip that. I'll just move to intercept 1, and this is where LEAD fits in, law enforcement assisted diversion and deflection. So in that intercept 1, which is all what police have to do, if you really step back, and I'm just going to go back and forth between slides, and you see when we first started this, there were very few things and very few tools for police officers. So what that meant was that police had a couple of options: arrest someone or take them to the hospital. And you can imagine that causes a lot of issues, as the professor was just talking about, right? So as we started to expand this, LEAD obviously being one of those things, but I also want to mention all these other things that go along that continuum. So having a co-response unit, someone asked me about it at the beginning again, so we were just, I think Concentrate just did an article about it, where you have a social worker and a police officer in the car together, who are responding specifically to mental health calls, but also doing follow-up and having the free time to do that. So is that the best thing? Not by itself, but is it something along that continuum that has to happen? So the way I think about all these is like rungs on a ladder. So you need every single rung to get to the top. So yeah, you need those things that are alternatives where police aren't responding. You need those tools in your tool belt for police when they do respond, and then multiple different tools in their tool belt. And then you need those things where police might respond and then call someone else out, like the CARES team. The CARES team is not a sheriff's office program. It's community mental health. But oftentimes it is where an officer gets dispatched. First, they show up to the scene, they start to triage things, and they realize, this is really not for us. It's somebody else who can come out. And then the assessment center, that's a physical location where an officer can drop someone off for like a 23-hour stay that is not a hospital or psych ER. It is not jail and arrest. It is, again, a deflection or a diversion system. So those things exist now within Washtenaw County. And again, I won't go through all of the intercepts because I know we want to focus on kind of 0 and 1 area, but there's other things down that line around reentry services and community corrections that are really, really important enhancements. So law enforcement assisted diversion and deflection. Many of you have been walking with us this entire time, years and years now in the making. So you know a lot about what it is, but for those who don't know, LEAD is really, again, a tool for officers. It's a pre-booking diversion tool. And so an officer comes in contact with someone who they may know has mental health challenges, addiction challenges, or extreme poverty challenges, and they keep coming into contact with the system. In the past, that person would just keep rotating in and out of the jail, in and out of the jail, multiple arrests. Now, what LEAD offers that officer is an alternative. Instead of arresting you, I can connect you to the LEAD team. I can get you in front of a social worker. And the key is, as long as that person is willing to meet with that social worker and do that initial assessment, the reason that I might have arrested that person or was going to arrest that person in the first place goes away. So for us, the D and that last D in LEAD around deflection is really that. Some communities that do LEAD, the case gets written, it goes to the prosecutor. So technically you're in the system. It sits there at the prosecutor. If you do what you're supposed to do, the prosecutor kind of puts it in a file, but it's still there, right? Here in Washtenaw County, we've adapted lead, and so it stays with the officer. And as soon as that person does the assessment, that thing is gone. It never makes it to the next step of the prosecutor, and so there's not the threat of any further action that happens. So that's just one small difference. And again, pre-booking is important because it's the officer getting that tool in their tool belt on the street to make that decision. Now, that doesn't mean that you don't need alternatives, so the officer never shows up in the first place, or that you don't need the social worker showing up if that officer wants to turn over, or you don't do co-response. It's a both and, not an either or, and having that full continuum. The goal of LEAD is to really increase the number of people who are getting those community services while decreasing the number of people who have contact with the criminal justice system or the criminal justice apparatus. It's a best practice model that was really started in Seattle, and we are one of 19 communities around the country that have been selected as kind of this next iteration to roll it out. Just to give it to you as far as what the cycle might look like, you know, someone's arrested, they're booked, detained, prosecuted, incarcerated, released. LEAD is right between that arrest and booking, again, right out on the street for the officer. And the goal is, when you make that initial contact, to have that handoff, that warm handoff right on the street. We do the handoff after the fact sometimes, but as you can imagine, sometimes it's harder to find the person, right? And so that warm handoff right from an officer to a social worker is really important. We are in a pilot phase right now, and so it right now is just in Ypsilanti Township. It is only with a select few deputies, about 15 of them who've been trained, because we really wanted to work out the kinks, establish the policy, but the goal is to roll this out countywide. People have asked why Ypsi Township. One of the biggest pieces of LEAD and why it was started in Seattle originally was it really was about racial disparities. In Seattle, they were seeing people of color arrested and charged around minor infractions at a much higher rate. And there were all kinds of court cases around it. In Ypsi, there's one of the more diverse communities for us. It's also one of our busiest areas. And so the ability to really test out the entire LEAD theory, it made sense to start within Ypsilanti Township. I just want to give you a sense of the kind of people we're talking about related to LEAD. So LEAD is not for everyone. LEAD is for specific individuals who are having repetitive contacts with the system. So this is a real person here. So this is not made up data. An individual who had 381 law enforcement contacts had 70 arrests in Washtenaw County. Think about that. One person that had that many contacts. And again, prior to LEAD and prior to some of these other things, all the officers had was, okay, either I do one of three things. I show up, some business owners asking me to do something, and I say, no, I'm not going to do that. I arrest the person or I take them to the hospital. So these were minor things like disorderly, some paraphernalia charges, maybe into a ton of trespassing for this person. What that equaled out to was 55 times in our jail. It dated back, his history started in 2005, equaled about 1,400, a little over 1,400 days in the jail, with a charge history of 176 different charges. So this is one person to think of. So what does LEAD do? Well, clearly the system isn't working, right? People are going in and out. This individual since 2005 is having multiple contacts, pretty much trespass from every business in the E-course and Michigan Ave corridor in the Ypsi Township area. No one is satisfied, and this person is not getting the help that they need. So now, have a contact with the individual. Instead of just arresting the person, the officer can say to them, how about instead of me arresting you, if I can connect you with someone who might be able to help? Now you can imagine, this is a history going back to 2005. So it is not a magic wand that you just hand this person over to a social worker and all of a sudden everything is good, no more contact, and all of his needs are met. This is an ongoing struggle, but LEAD and that officer on the street becomes the doorway into doing something different, and the opportunity for that person not to get their 56th time in the jail, or that 1,458th day in the jail, or that 177th different charge. So we are still in our pilot phase. We are getting closer to rolling out our first evaluation of that pilot phase. Right now, there are 44 people who are in the LEAD program. Most of them are referred by deputies, but there is the opportunity for a judge or a public defender or even a prosecutor to make a referral, just in case somehow someone slipped through a deputy making that referral. So about 6 of those 44 were referred by other parts of the system. Just trying to think of what else I can say about LEAD before I move into some of the other things. I think what we're seeing, and for this individual here, there was a 4-month period where he was sober, taking his medication, and employed, and no police contact. And that 4-month period was the longest period of no contact since he started having contact in 2005. So you may say, like, that is significant. That's significant for the community. That's significant for that individual. That is significant for that person's family. And it's also significant for the officers. So we are starting to see some, I think, positive outcomes from what LEAD is allowing us to do. One even more significant is one of the LEAD participants, and I won't share all the details of her story, but has literally credited LEAD with changing her life. And because it allowed her to get off the streets, get connected to the folks who can help. And just so you know, an officer starts the process, but it is a social worker and LEAD case managers who are at community mental health who are doing all the constant follow-up. They become the big brothers, big sisters, who is like the peer who's working with them. So we do have peers, peer outreach workers who do some of this work alongside the case managers, but also full-time case managers that are following up, meeting people where they are, transporting them to their appointments, helping them get the resources that they need. And that is just one way along that continuum of what we've begun to do here in Washtenaw County. I did just want to mention a few other components of that continuum, because I think we don't often talk about them like LEAD. You know, when we first started talking about the millage, LEAD was the example. And so I know a lot of people think about that. But we also do things a little bit different in other areas. That is around mental health, in my estimation. So We Live is all about violence intervention. And so people say, well, what exactly does that have to do with kind of mental health intervention or restorative practices? And I think We Live is a great example of law enforcement and community working together to do just those two things: mitigate disputes, but then also help with the mental health and the trauma associated with violent crime. So just one quick kind of diagram. Someone, a young person, or just someone in general, is a victim of a serious violent street crime. They're shot, they're stabbed, or they're violently assaulted. What normally happens is they get treated in the emergency rooms, they're admitted for surgery or whatever may happen, they get discharged, they go right back out to the street, and they leave with all that acute stress and PTSD. If you're a survivor of someone trying to literally kill you, there's a lot. You can imagine the PTSD and the trauma that is associated with that. There's also all those ACEs, or adverse childhood experiences, that were tied into your life prior to you ever getting into this particular situation. So what happens? The cycle goes on. Our great hospital systems in Washtenaw patch you up physically, but emotionally and mentally, you still have that trauma hanging over you. You might feel the need to get your own weapon, self-medicate, and retaliation happens, or that cycle continues. I won't go through all the data, but a large percentage of the individuals that wind up, or young people that wind up being a victim here, wind up in this cycle. The likelihood of them winding up a victim a second time is pretty significant. So what have we started doing? Well, with community organizations and some of our own staff, we started intervening right at that piece of right before they get out of the hospital. We call that golden window or golden opportunity, with people with lived experience who have been in these situations before. So this is how, for me, it ties into mental health, because it is about dealing with the acute stress and the PTSD that continues this cycle. The other part to that is you're talking about mitigating retaliation. Roughly 80 to 85% of the shootings in our community are believed to be retaliatory in nature. Someone does something, someone goes through this cycle, and they retaliate. Well, how do we mitigate some of that retaliation? Help people deal with the PTSD, the fear that they feel like they have to retaliate. Do it with community-based organizations and trained, kind of trusted advisors. And then you start to really deal with some of these. So how does this relate to law enforcement? Well, partly, if we really want to deal with community violence, it isn't just about arresting people. If you really want to deal with mental health issues, it isn't just about arresting people. And it isn't about waiting until someone does something before you actually intervene. And then it is also about using the mental health and police service mental health millage to actually fund to do some of this work. So some of this work is done by the sheriff's office, but some, you may have read in some of the news articles, is really done by community-based organizations. It's an ecosystems approach to deal with violence, but violence has a root that is based in mental health challenges. I just wanted to mention, because there was an article about the co-response unit. We're seeing some real, and again, the co-response unit is a social worker and a police officer in a vehicle together. They're on shift together. It's not, they're partners basically. And they are the primary responders to some of our mental health calls, but they also can do follow-up. And so together, they are going out and then helping individuals, getting to know individuals, and taking the time to get them connected to the services that they need. I say those three, and I highlight those three on that full continuum, because to me, those are the three that are directly tied into how might we help mitigate some of the future risks, how might we help deal with mental health, and how does it really intersect or prevent people from going into the criminal justice system, or at least finding a different pathway out of the criminal justice system. Ms. Belinda, I could talk about this stuff forever, but I know I have a limited amount of time, and I definitely want to answer questions. So I just wanted to give a quick overview, and I'm more than happy to answer additional questions if needed.
Thank you, Mr. Jackson. Thank you so much for your comment. I do see Representative Braybeck has joined us, and hi. So we're going to turn it over to you so that we can preserve as much time as possible for questions.
That's great. Thank you all for letting me be here with all of you. When I was listening to the speakers before me, I was thinking, oh, I wish we were having, a conversation, because there's so many times when there's so much that we are all doing in our different lanes that clearly intersects, as our work does all of the time, right? And so, I was really excited to hear what, both Tom and Derek shared with us. So thank you so much. Belinda, I know that, and thank you for introducing me. Just wanted to share a little bit that I don't know if this is included, but I am in the House right now, but my life before this, and for almost 30 years now, I've been a social worker and a clinical psychologist. I got my master's in clinical social work right out of college, and then worked with adolescents in a public high school. And I was the social worker for our gen ed population, and I worked in the dean's office. So if there were fights, if there were issues at home, teachers wanted help in the classroom, I got called in to all those kinds of conversations. And part of my love for working with adolescents and young people, started when I was in college, and I actually did an internship. Excuse me. I did an internship at in our county in Illinois, and I was a juvenile probation officer for a summer. And that meant that for me, there, of course, unfortunately, this would have been back in the early 90s. And they were short-staffed then. When I think about our staffing now, they were short-staffed then. And I was in court in the mornings, writing reports about the kiddos that I got to work with. And then in the afternoons, every afternoon, I was doing home visits, and hanging out with our kiddos and spending time with their families, being able to get to know them to ensure that recidivism didn't happen. What did they need, and how could we help so that that their trajectory changed? And so I just loved that, and I actually thought that I would get my JD and my MSW, and those were actually the grad schools that I applied to. But decided to just go along the mental health care path, but certainly have a love for working and partnering with our criminal justice world. And so when I think about kind of what has happened over the years, I feel like we see trends and, the pendulum shifts. And I can remember, again, 30 years ago, working in the field, and that co-response unit, that was very much present. And then we got away from it. And I remember never understanding why, because it made sense to me. And so, I'm so grateful for our sheriff and for Derek and for Trish Cortez, who is our director of our community mental health, for really putting all the energy into being a leader, not only in our state, but nationally around this work. And I know, Derek, you mentioned them, but King County, gosh, I feel like if I can grow up and be like King County, wouldn't it be great? Right? They do such remarkable work out there. And so some of the work that got to do when I was a county commissioner, got to really work a lot, on the intersection of our CMH consumers and folks who were in our jail, and knowing the high numbers, with folks who are in both of those systems, but also seeing the difference in the recidivism rate, and the rate at which folks would perpetrate another crime if they were in the CMH system. And so, we saw it as an opportunity to really be able to intervene and work with folks. And Derek and, our sheriff really, I feel like, just took the reins with that, and, to ensure that we were trying to do this differently here in Washtenaw County. And so, seeing the way that all the different ways that the co-response units have worked, I believe has literally saved lives in our community. When you have that mental health care provider working with a public safety officer, I feel like I have seen that work really, really beautifully, again, to be able to save lives. The other thing that and Derek, you talked about these, that I think is really important in terms of the treatment part. And as a provider, I think about that all the time, is how we have, again, in my 30 years of practice, how we have shifted and changed in really unhelpful ways. And so when I was a very young therapist, if I needed to hospitalize someone, I was able to hospitalize them and get them the treatment that they needed. There would be a bed. That person, if they needed medication, you were talking about that lead participant, Derek, if they needed medication, that medication would be offered and they would be stabilized before being discharged. And then they usually would be discharged to what we call a partial hospitalization, which is a much more scaffolding around the needs that they would have, not necessarily not inpatient, but folks would be at the hospital several days a week for that scaffolding. And then they would again step down to what was called intensive outpatient, which would be a couple of days a week, and then to outpatient. And now virtually those two middle parts of that continuum are all but gone. And which means that, again, as practitioners, when we get to work with folks, if we're lucky enough to get a bed, because there aren't enough beds for folks, and then we can't stabilize medication. If we, again, if we're lucky enough to have them, I've had folks who I have sent to different hospital systems in different states, here and in different states, and have had folks turned away. And then I, as a practitioner, have to figure out what to do with someone who is actively suicidal. But there were no beds. I've had a parent call me here in Michigan and say that the suggestion was that their 9-year-old child be hospitalized out of state, away from social supports, and I think about, and Tom and Derek both talked about this, the trauma that occurs with something like that as well, and the impact of that. And so I do think that there's a lot of work that we can do in terms of helping with our mental health care system, to be able to buttress that and support folks when there's that intersectionality in both systems. The other thing that I really think about, and this was touched on, but all of those social determinants of health, and I think about how we as legislators, and kind of my legislative hat, what we can do. So for instance, in education, one of the bills that I have right now is to increase the number of school counselors. Right now, Michigan ranks third from the bottom in terms of the number of school counselors, which is we should be ashamed and embarrassed about. We have one school counselor per 671 students. That is atrocious. When we're talking about being able to know our young folks and being able to help guide and lead them, and mentor them and all these, none of that can happen when there's one person for 671 students. And so I have a bill that would lessen that. I was actually talking with some folks just a couple of weeks ago in Woodhaven and Brownstown, they have reached what I think is an ideal. I mean, it's still not great, but it's much better. One counselor for 250 students. So still an incredible amount of students, but much better than where we are now. And talking about, how they got there, how do we do, how can we do that? How can we do it statewide? Colorado has some programming that I've been in touch with them, to see how we might be able to replicate those kinds of things here. But that's one of the things that I think we can do better and will impact this. I also think that in general, and I'm sorry if you talked about this before I was able to join you, we don't have enough mental health care providers, period. And so when I think about when I was working in the school system, like I said, I was the social worker for the general ed population. We had our social worker who worked with our special ed population. We had, then they were called guidance counselors, now school counselors, and we had school psychologists. Our team was so much more robust. And that was all in one building, all the time. I mean, we were there every day. So the teachers knew us, the administration knew us, the kids knew us. I was also a coach. And so that also then meant that the kids were comfortable coming to me, like it was cool, to go talk to me rather than not. But when you have those relationships, that matters in terms of what the kids are doing. But again, when there's such a dearth of providers, we don't have that opportunity to show up for our kids and to help prevent some of this. The other things when I think about kind of, again, in that legislative hat, I think about, I've had oh my gosh, I feel like for 2 years now, an appropriation. I've been asking for $15 million for the additional diversion programs throughout the state because we know how much they help. And so that I think is another way that we're going to kind of continue to be able to address these issues. And just yesterday, actually, I was having a conversation with a colleague and wondering about, with the results of the election and knowing kind of the way that our government is going to be arranged over the next couple of years, will we have opportunities to address sentencing and change sentencing guidelines? And so I've already started having that conversation with folks. And so I feel like there are a lot, I am hopeful, but we also know, and I was talking to this person, we were talking about sentencing guidelines. We don't have much time, about 18 months. And we were talking about how it would probably take us about 8 years normally, the normal legislative path to get these, but we don't have that time. And so, we're just, both of us are trying to kind of both jump in with 2 feet, to see what we can push on and get accomplished. And the other thing that I'm really excited about is right now, there are 110 of us in the House. Excuse me, I'm sorry. There are 110 of us in the House. I'm the only mental health care provider right now, the only one, which is also awful to me. And so every time I have the opportunity to talk with mental health groups and students, I always encourage them to think about life and being a public servant. Wasn't something that I anticipated. Someone asked me, and I love it and feel so lucky to be able to do it. But we need more mental health care providers who are in that legislative role and at those tables. Because one of the things that I have seen is that folks can make assumptions about the mental health care world that are incorrect, and then that impacts policy in ways that frankly can be incorrect and sometimes really harmful. And so, having more mental health care providers in our legislature will matter. I'm really excited because in our incoming class, there are going to be 2 folks who are joining me. One from Ann Arbor, Carrie Rengans has her MSW. Kimberly from, she is Rich Steenland. She'll be following Rich Steenland. She comes in with a master's in social work. And with their Betsy Coffia from up north in Traverse City has her BSW. So we're going to be getting some other folks who have that framework and look at our work through that lens. So I want to be able to hear from other folks and answer questions, but those are kind of the hats that I get to wear, and that the places where I think that I can push, and it will be interesting to see, what Carrie and Kimberly and Betsy, with their mental health care backgrounds, what they all choose to do as well. So thank you again for inviting me. Carolyn, thanks so much for including me, and happy to answer any questions as well.
Thank you so much. And I want to thank all of our panel guests tonight for sharing their insight. While this conversation is so complex and so layered, I also see glimmers of hope. So I appreciate your comments and being so candid with us. As we prepare to transition into the Q&A portion with Kathy Friedrichs, I want to remind everyone to put your questions in the chat. If that might be the easiest way to do that. If you raise your hand, we will do our very best to get to you. And if we're not able to answer your question tonight, I encourage you again to put it in the chat. And I believe our panelists will answer those questions individually, and we can also have them posted on the website for the Friends of Restorative Justice. So thank you. I'll turn it over to you, Kathy.
Thanks, Belinda. So we're lucky tonight to have somebody, Mark Creekmore, who's with the NAMI organization, the National Alliance of Mental Illness. And they are co-sponsoring this event. And Mark is going to kick us off with a question or a comment. Mark?
Thanks. Thank you so much for inviting NAMI to this event. NAMI is an organization of peers, people with lived experience, either people with mental health conditions or people who support those people with mental health conditions. We are not a clinical organization, and which is an important point I think you'll see. I want to summarize a few things before we get on, and I think it'll help people frame their questions. Dr. Hoffmeister's presentation of restorative justice, really the core of it is that it expands the workforce. And I want you all to think about the workforce limitations that exist now. You're really training both a person who is a so-called perpetrator and a so-called victim. You're training them in a role as a peer, and you're helping them through that interaction develop, transform a situation which was combative into one which is helpful. What you're doing there really is expanding the workforce. There's no clinician apparently in sight. There's no treatment. These are all normal people like you and me who, with a little bit of training and guidance, can assume a very important role in reducing the risk of that people face in their lives as perpetrators and as victims. So the workforce expansion, even though you didn't say it, that's what it sounded like to me, Dr. Hoffmeister, and thank you much for that. Derek was talking about working across systems. We have a tendency now to talk about sole systems and not crossing systems. The sheriff's department is getting into violence reduction and prevention, into the MOMS program, into social work. Now, many people who are abolitionists regarding police and who feel that they have the criminal justice system has so fundamentally corrupted the relationship, have given up on that cross system. But cross systems are another way that we can expand our workforce. So now we have criminal justice people doing risk reduction, which is actually an element in treatment programs. So thank you, Derek, for doing that. And then Felicia, you're talking about bringing money to the game. And money is important, but money can't buy us out of our workforce shortage. You could double the number of MSWs produced or BSWs produced out of the state institutions, educational institutions, and probably would not affect the workforce problems. If you look around, we don't have enough people to do the kind of work that we're demanding of them now. So I would like to frame people's questions very personally. What is it that you, the listener now, can see as being a participant in this reduction of risk for people with mental illness? How could you, what experience do you have? Are you a grandparent? Are you in a school system? Are you are you volunteering at a homeless or a food event to provide people with basic services? You have the capacity to solve a lot of these problems as being a member of a trained peer, if you are a peer, or a trained volunteer. And we need to expand the workforce that's actually dealing with the problems that we have in criminal justice and mental health. And we can't buy our way out of it. There's not enough clinicians in God green earth to do this. It's going to come down to us. How can we become not bystanders, but participants in the system? So can you please reflect on that yourself and say, Dr. Hoffmeister, what can I do? How can, Alicia, Rep Brabeck, what can I do? How can I get involved? How can I get involved in creating a volunteer, trained, specialized peer workforce that would solve the kinds of problems that the mental health system needs? So I'll stop it there. Thanks.
Thanks, Mark. That's really good food for thought, for all of us here who are interested in these issues. And I think we have 3 questions that have been submitted already. And Joe just said that he thinks he would like to go first. Is that right, Joe? Do I understand that?
Go ahead.
No. Okay.
Okay.
All right.
Okay, so quick question. So one of the things I think we can document is that there's been a criminalization of youth and mental health, which means that behaviors that previously were dealt with in other ways, now you're charged with felonies and end up in prison. And unfortunately, the restorative justice model, in most places, you're not allowed to work with those people around things that are considered violent crimes. So how do we open the gates to dealing with the kinds of crimes that have led us to have such a high mass incarceration rate in our world? Because clearly the rest of the world is not doing what we're doing.
So, Joe, are you directing your question at anyone in particular?
I guess because we're so short on time, I'd love 30-second responses from any or all.
I'll be brief, but you know, in We Live, this is a part of it, right? It's people who have maybe even pulled the trigger at some point, who now redeemed themselves to do some of this work. And you can see, if anyone's paying attention, sometimes we're getting massive pushback on that, right? And so I think it requires people like this who really believe in this work, when they see something like that, to really speak out and say, whoa, 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 wait a minute. Peers around mental health, peers around those who are committing violence and may have lived that life, but now can help people out. Like, peer work is important. It's an expertise. I got a degree out of a book, but there's some people who got a degree out of that lived experience. And I can imagine, as Mark was saying, like NAMI, those who support people who are suffering with mental health challenges. Mark, you have a degree in that, right? Of how to help other families go through that. And so investing in that, in my case, the example I'm using, that anti-violence workforce, is hugely important, but also investing in those who can do some of that peer work, Joe. So I know it's a little bit off of what you were saying, but I do think we need to call out those who try to add stigma to the kind of work that we're talking about needs to be done.
Joe, I think that your question's a great question. And part of what, and Mark, I can't remember who just said it. I'm sorry, folks. I pulled into my driveway about 3 a.m. this morning from session. So I'm sick and operating on about 3 hours of sleep. So I apologize if I'm stammering a bit. But when I think about the different ways that we can help, particularly, with young kids, that's partly where my brain goes, right? Is like where are the interventions earlier? And part of what I didn't finish my thought was when I was talking about the social determinants of health, whether it's, education, housing, employment, healthcare, food security or insecurity. Those are all places that each one of us can do something about. We can all intervene with folks on all of those levels. So and that all of those then impact mental health care, right? And so, I think that it's larger than just thinking about, either the mental health care system finitely, or, the public safety system finitely, but how do all those other determinants fit in and impact the larger picture, and what, we can all do those kinds of things on a one-on-one basis, but we are also really lucky in our community to have so many organizations that tap into all those social determinants of health as well.
Thank you, Felicia and Derek. Professor Hoffmeister, would you like to give a quick little response?
Well, for the most part, I will defer to the people on the ground, because I think they have the expertise you should be listening to. The one thought that did pop in my mind is that this is a conversation, or these conversations are of a nature that I've heard many times over the years. And we as a society, we seem to continuously go back and forth between being tough on crime to trying to help those who are in need. And right now, I like to think that in part, there's this pushback against being too tough on crime, and so maybe we are opening ourselves up to these wonderful other options that you're hearing described here. But we also have to recognize at some point there's going to be, and you see signs of it already, there's going to be this wave coming back that says things are out of control. We have to control these individuals, which means locking them up. I think that's a bad outcome, but we need to at least be aware of that reality.
Thank you, Professor. Okay, let's go to our next questioner. I think Hersa, you had a question you would like to bring forth.
Yeah, the question that I had was, and probably it should go to Derek, because you've had some experience with this now in the LEAD program, is do you think that, like in Washtenaw County right now, that the community mental health system will really be adequate to taking care of, to caring for these people who have mental health issues, who need to be diverted from the criminal justice system?
That's a great question. Actually, it was one of the bullet points I meant to talk about when I first was speaking. So, LEAD is a systems approach. So you got the prosecutor, public defender, CMH, everyone's at the table. So that's a great thing. And we are triaging, making contact But what we're missing is what Felicia really talked about, the larger systems issues, the lack of beds for people who need to go, the lack of workers to do this work. So one of our biggest fears, and we identified this way back 7 years ago when we were in Seattle in King County, specifically to Washtenaw County, is we have a lot of great resources, but not all the resources are tailored to the population that LEAD is really focused on. And so Hertha, to your point, CMH has some of those resources and they're helping some, but we need many more. And part of what LEAD, even in Seattle, has helped them to do is identify those larger systems gaps. Even with We Live and the violence intervention work, I think we're doing a phenomenal job of meeting those young people in the hospital rooms. But guess what? What happens after you have that rapport, right? Now you got to think about all these other steps that in our community just today, or actually tomorrow morning, we're transporting a kid who's moving to Grand Rapids because they have certain resources for that population that do not exist here in Washtenaw County. So, so great point, Hertha, and I think that's something we need to really develop and work on here in Washtenaw.
Thanks, Derek and Hertha. Kathy Gourlay, would you like to bring your question, and then we'll open it up to the respondents. I've already received 2 on the chat.
My question involves training restorative justice facilitators. And I guess, you know, Tom could answer this, or maybe Belinda Doolin from the DRC needs to answer this. Is there special training needed, and are we doing that if the restorative justice is going to involve people with a mental disorder? Do the facilitators need special training? So either Tom or Belinda.
Tom or Belinda, would you like to take that?
I'll speak up on behalf of the Dispute Resolution Center here in Washtenaw County. Whenever we take on a specialty topic, and this one would be, we do expect to have some training for those who are experts in the field from what are the nuances of these kinds of cases that we might be able to expect, what are the boundaries. We have the intersection of several different institutions involved. Community mental health might be involved, as we're hearing tonight. Maybe law enforcement might be involved, other agencies might be involved. So what are some of the boundaries around it in those discussions? Have a deeper understanding around mental health, triggers, terminology, all of the things that go into that. I'm not expecting for facilitators to be an expert per se around the topic of mental illness, but we are to be astute as we facilitate so that we can be inclusive of all of the parties involved, including the person with the diagnosis, so that we can know how to engage properly with that person. And we may have to be flexible with the circle process in order to accommodate the parties in that discussion. So those are the things that come to mind as I'm listening to that tonight, if we are able to move forward. And I'm sure there's a whole lot that I don't know to even ask in responding to this question.
Thanks, Belinda. So why don't we open it up to
Tom was going to answer, I think.
I'm sorry, Tom, go ahead. You're muted, Tom. Tom, we can't hear you.
Is that better?
Yep.
That's better?
Yep.
Okay. I would just say that Belinda, I thought, expressed it very, very well. The only thing I would add is the reason these facilitators need training, a certain level of expertise, is because of how many stereotypes and misconceptions there are about mental disorders in general. And those have a great potential to undercut this kind of work. And so you really do need some kind of expertise, some kind of understanding. I won't try to identify how you arrive at that, but it can't be just someone who walks in off the street.
Great, thank you, Tom. All right, we'd like to open it up to all of you. We have 2 ways that you can enter. I've received 2 questions already through chat, but if you raise your hand, we will recognize you. Carolyn will unmute you and you can speak. So let me just say the first question is to Derek, that your remarks were pretty much focused around adults, and this person was wondering, what about youth? What resources do you have for the youth, and what changes are needed so that we have a better system going forward in the future?
It's a great question. I'll say, although our officers do interact with youth, like our jail, we don't run the youth detention center or juvenile court. So a lot of the young people come through a different process. So some of the things that we really focus on as far as like our jail and reentry and the deputies really do focus on adults. I will say that we're in the process, we meaning the county, is in the process of designing a youth assessment center like the adults have. So that is not in existence yet, but that is at the very early stages. We're working with a national organization to help walk us through that process. We Live, believe it or not, all the violence intervention and that trauma work has been primarily with youth. It's very unfortunate, but there are quite a few of the shootings that have happened that have been all young people. And it's kind of leads, I see Audrey's question as well, so I'll just jump ahead a little bit. But We Live, one of the things we need in our community is an organization or a trauma therapist and a trauma group for these young people that have been survivors of serious violence, because that mental health challenge, again, is still there. In Detroit, which is where we mimicked our program off of, they have, I'm a social worker, a trained therapist, and when I went there and I saw 20 young men and women who were all survivors of gun violence, they lived that street life, excited to see their therapist, arguing over who gets to see the therapist first, I was like, what? Like, how did you create the environment that made this a cool thing to do? And so, again, we need to create that in Washtenaw. We do not have it. What we're doing now around young people, we just took our first 3 young people to the Corner Health Center. They hired a new therapist about a year ago now, who has some experience in this work. And so our hope is that that outgrowth turn into a youth-focused group there. So right now, specific to your question, Glenn, the Youth Assessment Center is in development, and We Live is primarily for young people at this point. What do we need to do? We need to continue to build out those resources. The young person I mentioned that we're taking to Grand Rapids in the morning, he's an 18-year-old with no housing, has some criminal history involvement, and he's homeless, right? But because he's currently involved in the juvenile justice system, none of our youth serving organizations or housing providers, there was nowhere in Washtenaw County for us to take him, nowhere. He didn't qualify. Even if there was a bed open, because in this particular case, he's on house arrest, they're like, I'm sorry, he can't come here. And so those kinds of things we really need to think about. And we all know it, because I think, Joe, you said in the beginning, it's unfortunate, but lots of the folks we're talking about with mental health challenges, they wind up in our jail at some point. And so criminal history goes with this. And so thinking about all these access to resources, sometimes that's prohibitive for some of our local resources. How do we start to change that, in particular for young people in the future?
Thanks, Derek. Also, I think Audrey had another part to her question, which was during an acute PTSD phase in the We Live program, is a referral made to a mental health resource.
So it is, that's one of our primary things. Housing and getting them physically safe and housed somewhere has been the #1 thing we've learned. Like, we got to do that first to stop retaliation. And then the second thing is to get them, after the medical care, connected with someone for long-term care. It's hard right now, like convincing people that they need this. One of our workers, he was shot 20 years ago, and he still wakes up to this day just with night terrors from when he was shot. So him being able to share his story with a 16 or a 17-year-old is helping them think, okay, when I'm old like that dude, I don't want to be having those night terrors, so I need to get invested now. That goes back to one of the earlier questions around the peer work and how important it is. I can't share that story. One of our older peer workers who've been shot, who's now in a wheelchair, like, he can tell them, this is what you're going to go through, and they're going to listen in a way. And so we're just getting better at getting them connected to some of those resources.
Thank you, Derek. I think Judy Gardner has her hand up.
I do. I just wanted to make a comment, but I also want to thank Derek for your great presentation, and of course, and Felicia, and the gentleman who spoke. And I am so sorry I'm forgetting your name, the main speaker. You were fantastic with your PowerPoints. It was great. But let's don't forget that, I work for NAMI. I'm the executive director. And one of the things that always sticks out for me every time I come to a circle such as this, is we don't talk a lot about the family or support people or the caregivers. And it's so important that families are also brought into the conversation and educated, and that empowers us all. I mean, fighting stigma around mental illness, a lot of families don't even understand their loved ones aren't what they're living with and what this is and how to even help them. You know, the sheriffs cannot, the police department cannot solve everything. As Belinda was saying, it's such a complex, and there's so many layers and everything is so complex. But I just want to, when Felicia said that we all can be a part of the solution, we can by educating ourselves and trying to educate the general public and our neighbors about mental illness. It affects every family. And until we all understand and stop treating people that are different or their behaviors are different, who live with mental illness, I think it's going to be a much tougher road, a bigger battle. So it really does take all of us. And I just wanted to say that, you know, we all need to be a part of the solution, because it's no one system that's going to be able to fix this. Thanks for the time.
Thank you, Judy. Appreciate your comments.
Can I,
Thank you so much.
Kathy, can I follow up to what Judy
Sure.
just said?
Go ahead.
Thank you. I appreciate it. So Judy, I think you're spot on. And that's why I was so appalled when it was said that, you know, a 9-year-old be moved out of state, you know, being away from parents and support, because that support is so important. Part of what I forgot to mention, and I had written down, and Derek, you reminded me, I was like, oh, I forgot to talk about that, but you know, is all that the trauma. But I had, you know, not only the trauma of, you know, the person perpetrating or the victim or survivor of the crime, but also how that continues to be perpetrated, whether that's in, you know, an additional crime or in our jails or prisons, where there may be, you know, additional trauma, you know, but also then, and someone said it, and I can't, I'm sorry, I'm listening, Jackie, you know, about the secondary street trauma and, you know, witnesses seeing things, you know, we just don't have, and again, Mark, getting back to, you know, the thing that we're talking about, there aren't enough providers, let alone trauma-informed providers, to be able to work in our communities as we need them to.
Great. Thank you, Felicia. So I think we have time for one last question, even though there's several in the chat. I'm sorry I can't get to them all. Harvey, you talked about the county commissioners talking about some monies that were going to be available, and you're asking how this grant will fit into the other programs underway, such as LEAD. Is that clear enough, or do you want more detail?
Yeah, so real quick, there's not a direct tie to LEAD, but again, I think it's a both and so I know we're really short on time, so I won't go into the details of it, but so it's not directly tied to LEAD in any specific way.
Right. Thank you. I think is that it, Kathy? You're going to wrap things up?
Yep. Yeah, I'm sorry we can't get to all the questions, but it's been a very educational night. I thank all the presenters and and Belinda and Mark and everyone who's here for your good questions. Friends of Restorative Justice is going to keep trying to expand the use of restorative justice to in more and more situations, to more serious crimes, more violent crimes, to crimes involving more serious mental health, schools in the community, and we just think it's a good solution to crime, mass incarceration, and perhaps a division within our communities now too. And we hope to hold more educational events in 2023. If any of you have ideas or suggestions for topics that you would like us to cover, Carolyn, can you put our email address in the chat, info@friendsofrestorativejustice.org. So just email us, and we'll consider it. I also want to thank our sponsors tonight, Friends of Restorative Justice, the Dispute Resolution Center, the Michigan Collaborative to End Mass Incarceration, the National Alliance, let's see, I might not get this exactly right, Mental Illness Okay. I know it's NAMI. I just always call it
Yes,
NAMI.
National Alliance on Mental Illness.
Okay, and the Michigan Center for Youth Justice and the Restorative Justice Group of the Unitarian Universalist Congregation of Ann Arbor. So we have all your email addresses who registered, and we'll send you a link to the recording that we made tonight, and we will invite you to future educational events that we have. If you go to our website, friendsofrestorativejust.org, there's a contact us button, and you can type it in there in the website. I want to thank everyone for coming and hope you have a good rest of your night and good holidays coming up, and hopefully see you next year.